I've always loved harmony. There's something about the idea of taking something and then adding voices underneath it or around it and transforming it. And with a simple melody, it's easier to do that sort of thing. You can take a simple melody and do so many things with the harmony and with the rhythm. It's sort of an open creative field. I didn't discover jazz till I was in 7th grade or so, and before that, my early listening was mostly classic rock. My parents had some, vinyl rock albums. We had like Boston, and I remember in high school I had my mom's old turntable with speakers on the side of the room, and then I figured out how to hook more speakers to it, so I had this basement room with speakers all around, and I'd put these old vinyl records on. And I got sucked into Dave Weckl band, just fusion stuff, Chick Corea. I listened to Chick Corea nonstop for years. So my listening has been sort of all over the place. Part of what kind of got me going with the, hymns and lyrical tunes again. From high school, I had this vision of being able to just improvise on the marimba and just play tunes, because I was playing jazz with my high school band and with another group. I've always thought, I think I'm like a jazz pianist who never really learned how to play piano or jazz. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle of all that. But if I could do that on marimba, that would be amazing. And one time I had a teacher, he pointed to the marimba and he said, "Can you play jazz on that thing?" And I just kind of went, "Oh no," but inside I was like, "Oh, if only I could." How can you play a melody, have a full accompaniment? Like very often I have Nat King Cole singing in front of an orchestra. I have that kind of sound a lot of the times when I'm trying to put these tunes together. The first tune that I really played around with was When I Fall in Love. That was when I was at North Texas, 2000, probably 2008, 2009, with no intent at all of ever doing anything like that in front of people. I was just like warming up and messing around. It kind of worked. That was the first time I ever really attempted to do that. And it was awkward, and it didn't sound very good. It didn't feel very good, but it kind of opened the door to that, just a tiny little crack. And then a couple years later, 2010, Steve Houghton, he was the guy that sort of spearheaded this idea at IU. They did we have weekly master class, and they decided, well, let's do a Christmas party. And anybody who wants to bring in some Christmas music, we'll play for each other, eat some cookies. Something snapped in my brain, and I thought, okay, this is the chance to really try this. So I took the Christmas song, Mel Torme's Christmas song, and that was my first real arrangement. I thought, maybe I could actually do this. And afterwards, I felt horrible. Oh, that went terribly. And then everybody else disagreed with that idea, and I thought, this is something I could do more of. Yeah, that dedication. So actually, around the same time, so when I was at North Texas, around 2008, I'm kind of a computer geek, and I wanted to be able to record on my computer. Now, this was 12 years ago when it was possible, but you had to have the highest end stuff to make that work. I didn't have the highest end stuff. And every time I tried to record, something would go wrong, or the recording would be glitchy. Like, I had bad luck with just trying to record, I don't know, for whatever reason. But at one point, I sort of got things working, and I just wanted to hear, what would it sound like if I played marimba with like a Rhodes keyboard and a drum set and a bass line. And I had this little groove, and I got the recording to work, and so I recorded the little marimba vamp, and then I recorded bass line and eventually put drums on top of it. It turned into this little 2-minute demo of just me screwing around in the practice room. But I liked it, and it became like the main little groove in dedication, like the thing when the marimba comes in, that little groove, like the main hook, that came from this little experiment at North Texas. And then I had it on an MP3 file or something and filed it away and didn't touch it for years. And then in 2014, my last IU recital, life was bearing down on me, and I just want to end my recital with something fun. I just want to write something and just jam out. And I always remembered I always wanted to do something with that little demo. And then I want to improvise on the marimba. I think that may have been that recital was probably the first time that I improvised on marimba in front of an audience. And I had been listening to a Maria Schneider tune called Cerulean Skies. I hope I'm saying that right. And that's an epic 21-minute journey for her big band. Right in the middle of that, everything kind of breaks down, and then there's this almost hymn-like section right in the middle of everything. And it's the most gorgeous, touching moment of this epic, amazing 21-minute piece. And so I'm just going to go for it. And so right in the middle, dedication, it kind of builds up, and then everything stops, and there's a little marimba solo in the middle, which is it was my last IU recital. It was dedicated to my parents. And so I thought this will be cool. Like the heart of that piece is that solo right in the middle. Everything else kind of is just building up to that and then falling away from that. If I'm trying to arrange something, then I'm just playing at the marimba all the time. And the process has changed a little over the years, because I used to be not as comfortable doing this kind of thing on the marimba. So I would typically learn the tune on the piano, just figure out what voicings I like, and probably do a little transcription along with it to just find voicings and figure out what I wanted to do with the melody. I'd make sure I knew the tune before I even touched the marimba, because for me, playing that kind of stuff on the marimba was like my brain was only focused on getting my hands around, so I wasn't really, like if I didn't know the tune already, then it was going to be a lost cause. Now I can start at the marimba. That was sort of a turning point in my process, is when I got comfortable enough being flexible at the marimba that I didn't have to go to the piano. Sometimes I still do, but it's not a requirement anymore. Improvising, it's sort of, for me, it's, having some idea of what I'm going for, usually some kind of sound or texture or something, and then you just try something. Oh, that wasn't it. That's not going to work. Let me try it again. You just keep trying it, and just keep playing the tune over and over again. Or just, sometimes it's thinking like, how do I want this to start? What mood do I want to create right at the beginning? And then with that in mind, start playing and see what comes out. And, sometimes you hit on something that you really like, and sometimes you don't. But it's a very free thing. I never like write it first and then play it. I know other people that do that. They'll sit at the computer and create the arrangement and then play it. That's not at all how I work. A big influence for me early on was Eric Sammut, and part of the reason for that, senior year of high school, I got the chance to take marimba lessons with Kevin Bobo. He was in Wichita, Kansas. I had never heard of Eric Sammut, but Sammut was like Bobo's favorite marimbist at the time. You're naturally going to be sort of intrigued by your favorite marimbist's favorite marimbist. So I learned some Eric Sammut music, which was fascinating and involved, at the time I was learning about jazz harmony and voicings and things. So Sammut's music is full of that stuff, seventh chords and alterations and things like that. So that's another big influence in how I try to write for the instrument, especially the way he uses his left hand and sort of combines the left and right hands. And in practice, the way he tries to have his hands operate as independently of one another as possible. I've seen him play, just sort of messing around, set up an ostinato and play a melody in a totally different tempo with his other hand. There's all sorts of freedom. That opens up all sorts of texture possibilities. And when he improvised, he's an improviser. That intrigued me early on. He was known as this guy. He improvises on solo marimba. That was it's kind of a unique thing, So that early on, when I had this idea of wouldn't it be great to improvise on the marimba, I think that idea came from hearing about this French guy that really does it. He plays whole concerts and improvises. I think the marimba is capable of creating a unique texture. And again, this is something that Eric Sammut talked about a little bit, his placement of bass notes and things. Things don't always line up right on the beat. And again, especially the more he allows his hands to kind of separate, you end up with something that I think that's when you start to enter the realm of playing music that really can only sound good on the marimba. That was one thing. I remember my undergrad teacher had something similar to say. J.C. Combs is who I'm talking about. He was at the very first PASIC, where he saw Lee Howard Stevens premiere Hellbel Preludes and playing Bach and all this stuff, and then he saw Gordon Stout premiere the Mexican dances, and his comment about that was Gordon Stout was one of the first guys to start really writing music for the marimba. It wasn't an arrangement, it wasn't a transcription, it was written in a way that you could only get that effect on the marimba. The Mexican dance where the left hand's kind of moving around and the right hand fills in the harmony, so it's sort of simultaneously rhythmic and also lyrical. That's another sort of interesting thing about the instrument. And that makes it a lot of fun to play. It's challenging, if you're trying to create a long sustained sound over the course of a phrase or a piece, you got to play a lot of notes. You can't hang out too long. It depends on if you're playing on an instrument that's in good shape and you're playing in a nice resonant room, then you can take a little more time. But you do have to keep playing, in order to have a sustained sound, you have to keep hitting the darn thing. That's the big problem we're all up against, everybody who plays that instrument. You got to keep hitting the thing. But how can you keep hitting the thing and yet not have it just sound like a million notes? This is a big challenge. Like how do you play continually and yet the main thing that the listener picks up on is ba da 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 da. But meanwhile, your hands are doing this. And it comes down to dynamic shading and phrasing. I mean, this doesn't just apply to my stuff. This applies to Bach. This applies to Kevin, Bobo, whatever. What is in the foreground? What's not in the foreground? And if you can really exaggerate the difference. A lot of times people play that music, but the contrast isn't there. You know, the foreground and the background are right up against each other. And when you play it like that, it sounds like a bunch of notes. You can't really pick up on any individual idea. There's many ideas. There's a bass line going on, there are little figures, there's a melody floating on top of all that. So you really have to be in control of that. You've got to be able to play soft, subtle, sort of low to the keyboard, but then bring out the things you want to bring out in a natural way. If you just pound the melody notes, then it's not going to work. So even if your hands are moving like this, maybe there's a melody in there that's ba 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 ba. I mean, no matter what your hands are doing, you gotta clearly hear and feel that line. And if you make it sound like it's being played by one person on one instrument, even though it's in reality, it's sometimes mallet 4, sometimes mallet 2, sometimes mallet 3, you're moving all over the place. But yet if it sounds like it's sort of its own independent voice, then it starts to work. If you give a line a shape, then that line starts to make sense as its own idea. Even more subtle shape, you know, maybe little micro phrasing on little figures, and then an overarching phrase that sort of ties everything together. That sort of blends everything together and creates this coherent message instead of just a bunch of individual notes. In the stuff that I write, there's usually a long phrase mark showing you kind of where the melody is. There might be some other phrases, other phrase mark like slurs. There's sort of, you know, there are phrase markings and then there are slurs, and hopefully if you're really looking at the score, you can kind of tell which is which. So I might use a slur to group together a little inner figure or just show the shaping of a small idea. But then those overarching phrase marks are showing you the bigger ideas. So if you're trying to tackle one of these pieces, I mean, that's the main thing. Isolate the melody, figure out what the melody is, which in some cases I'm changing the rhythm or embellishing it a little bit, so you got to kind of pick that apart. But if you really know where the melody is, phrase the melody as you would if that was the only thing you were doing. And when you're satisfied with that, then start adding the other voices back in. But try to maintain the phrasing that you had when you just played the melody alone. Or better yet, sing it. I mean, that's really, like a lot of times I'll have students just sing the melody. And, you know, when I was 18, I would have been terrified and weirded out by that, but I don't care anymore. That's actually the best way to do it because you get a sense of what the breath is, where are you naturally going to pause, what does it feel like to exhale that idea instead of just hitting it. So if you can isolate that, know what the tune is, know what the phrase is, then start to add everything back in. Then you've given your ears a chance to hear what that melody is, and you'll be in a better position to judge if it's still coming through clearly or not. Best of all, then again, record yourself and find out if it sounds the way you think it does, because it usually doesn't. Yeah, like, you know, measure 28, the second statement of the melody of Danny Boy. There's a lot going on there. When you look at the page, it looks kind of crazy, actually. You know, triplets and grace notes and 30-second notes and fivelets and things. I mean, that's my attempt at trying to capture the freedom. But when you look at that, it's hard to tell if you're not thinking about these kind of things we've been talking about. It would be tempting to play all the fast stuff really loud and just think of it all as licks. And if you do that, you lose that contrast. So that's actually a really good section because the page is very busy, but yet when you really break it down, the melody can and should still be perfectly clear. There are some fun the little 30-second note rip and lick in measure 31. I mean, that's a little more chopsy. I had to throw a little chops in there. I think based on what I've heard from students that have worked on this music, I think something that, for the people who are drawn to this kind of thing, part of what draws them to it is that it's lyrical, but it also takes there's some chops in there too. Even when it's lyrical, there's a technical thing that makes it fun to play once you wrap your hands and your ears around it. So it's not just one of a lot of pieces are either really technically challenging or really flowing and beautiful, but I'm trying to sit right in between those two. And you can totally do it, but you have to be sensitive to everything we just talked about. I like to use the analogy of running the lights for play or something. Like, where do you put the spotlight? You could put the spotlight anywhere you want. There's a whole world of things going on. I mean, the tune is this sort of abstract thing. There's a melody, there's harmonies, there's rhythms, there's everything you can do with all of that. There's this whole world of stuff that you could possibly focus on. Where do you put the spotlight? Sometimes the spotlight might not be the melody. It may be the melody for a while, and then you point the light over at the bass line for a second, and then you bring it back to the melody for a second, and then there's this little inner echo figure in the middle of everything that you want to bring out, and then you point the spotlight back at the melody. I mean, that's something else that can make this kind of stuff, I think, interesting to play and to listen to. Is it's not just one thing. There's so many things going on inside the texture. So from the listener's point of view, hopefully it doesn't get boring. Again, the melody's got to be there because that's what you're really listening for. But in and around the melody, and especially between phrases, and this is where you can get creative with the arranging side of things too, because if you're doing an arrangement, maybe you state the first phrase and then you could move right on, or you could do a little something between the phrases, or you can expand the thing in so many different ways. That opens up all kinds of doors. Getting into measure 36, sort of the second half of the tune, this is Danny Boy. You know, the melody is ba 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 ba, and there's a whole lot of activity, especially on the left hand. There's like a fanning beam, a little filler thing in there, sort of filling in the harmony. Not even at the end of the phrase. The phrase goes over about a bar and a half, but the activity in the left hand sort of fills in the gaps. Actually, a good way to think of it, my thinking kind of got pointed in this direction through a guy, Robert Shatroma. He was one of my marimba teachers at North Texas. Pointed out that, sometimes it's the melody, but sometimes you're playing the pianist comping behind the melody. That's kind of what's going on, especially in this passage here. If you look at, especially where the phrase markings are, and then look at what's going on either between the phrase markings or underneath in the gaps in the spaces between the melody. This is, marimba doesn't sustain, so you play a note. This goes back to the thing, you got to keep hitting it, right? What are you going to do to fill in the space from the end of one idea to the beginning of the next idea? Make the smaller ideas special. Give them a certain amount of life, give them a little bit of phrasing. Dynamic shading and contrast, but within that, what are you doing with the foreground to make it special, and what are you doing with the background to make it also special? I was taking jazz piano lessons long ago, and I wrote this tune. I don't know what tune it was. It just had some little thing I wrote and brought into my teacher, and the end of the tune just kind of went thwomp. It just kind of stopped on a chord, and he said, man, you gotta make your ending special. Like when he's playing a ballad in a restaurant or something, like he said he'd kind of try to stretch the ending, so if somebody's listening to the tune, it's their favorite song and they don't want it to end. No, don't end yet. And he kind of stretches it just a little more, just to hold on to that feeling a little bit longer. So a lot of times in my codas, I'm kind of trying to do that. Like the tune basically comes to an end, but can you keep it alive just a little longer, just to hold on to that feeling a little longer? Keith Jarrett's the king of that. Listen to Tokyo 96, that album, when they do Never Let Me Go. His coda on that tune will make you cry. Like that's the best part of the tune, is after they've basically finished, and then he takes over, and it turns into the most gorgeous thing you've ever heard. So that's something else that's kind of on my mind, is like, again, I'm a jazz pianist that never learned how to play jazz piano. Like I'm trying to borrow or steal or whatever you want to call it. Keith Jarrett, Herbie Hancock, Bill Evans, those are big influence. Like in terms of my listening, those would be the names that have really definitely affected my attempt at taking a simple tune and making it special. That's what's sort of magical to me about this whole process. You take something so simple. I mean, sometimes the melody is just like a scale, but you can turn it into something really beautiful just through all these different parameters. I mean, what you do with the harmony, yes, but what you do with the phrasing, what you do with the accompaniment, how you present it, what mood do you set. And hopefully there's a little connection to the audience. The Fairview Hymns, I mean, that was written for a pastor friend of mine who was relocating to a different church, and everybody had the highest respect for this guy. They asked me sort of secretively, could I bring a marimba in to do a little thing for his last service. So they had a list of his favorite hymns. So I had to find the number one favorite hymn was "Come Down, O Love Divine." So okay, I'm going to figure out how to make it work. I don't even know what I'm going to do with it, but that has to be in there. And then I sort of listened to some of the others on the list, and Bleak Midwinter. This was in the middle of the summer, so I didn't really have Christmas on my mind at the time. But it was on the list, and it sounded like it just struck me as something I'd be able to do something with. So I worked on it, and I was, Bleak Midwinter came together pretty quickly, but the "Come Down, O Love Divine" bit of it, I don't know what to do with this. I have no idea. I don't think I'm going to be able to make this work. It felt, kind of dry when I first heard it, when I tried to think of what I was going to do with it, because I couldn't handle it the same way I handled Bleak Midwinter, because I already did that in this arrangement. Like, how can I make this different? And I wasn't sure how to handle it. And then I just had this, just on a whim, what if I just made it kind of funky? I just had this sort of groovy rhythm, and then kind of forced it, just sort of morphed it into fitting with that kind of vibe, and it like immediately worked. Like, I went from about to give up on it to like, clearly this is gonna work in a matter of seconds, once I got the right kind of idea in my head and just tried it. There was enough of a shimmer of an idea that I knew I had something, and I just had to go find it. My theory teacher in undergrad, he said that for him, composition was like he's in the dark, and then there's a flash. You know, when lightning flashes and you see everything clear as day for just like a split second. And so he said it was like that. For him, composition is waiting for that flash of lightning, seeing the whole thing, everything in front of him, and then having it go dark again. And then the compositional process was fumbling around in the dark, trying to rediscover what he saw in that flash. Because it's kind of the same thing here. Like, I didn't know what to do with Come Down, O Love Divine, and then all of a sudden, there it is. It's gonna work, but I don't know what it is yet. But it's there. Like, I know it's there now. I just have to find it. You know, and that's when it's really fun to work on, because you feel yourself constantly moving towards something that you're already excited about, as opposed to just feeling lost and hoping something falls into place. Like, you know it's there, you just have to find it. Actually, yeah, you know, Fairview this thing is full of little filler ideas. You know, the main melody, ba 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 da ba ba. Especially in the opening, you know, starting at measure 5 or whatever, is a pretty clear, simple statement of that melody. And then it's usually sort of broken between the hands, little quintuplet ideas or triplets. That's very clearly melody being harmonized very simply, and then a little piano lick. That's basically what's going on there. In fact, there's some really blatant piano-inspired licks, like measure 36, the sort of almost gospel-y kind of piano fill, and the little bluesy stuff in measure 34. That's all. Like, that's not the melody. Those are spots where it's just begging for that spotlight to get shifted just a little bit, as long as you shift it back again. And, you know, along with that, it comes down to when you establish the general dynamic level of a melody or a certain idea. As long as you sort of maintain that tone color, you maintain that dynamic level, you can depart from it and play something else. And if you come back to that same basic dynamic, same basic tone color, same basic articulation, that helps the listener kind of hear the connection between those things. So you can be playing a melody, and then you come down here for a second and play a secondary idea. When you come, as long as you pick the melody up in the same sound, the same mood, you know, the same approach that you departed from, as long as you pick it up in the same way that you left it, it still sounds coherent. It sounds like it's continuing. Whereas if you're playing along and then you just sort of bombastically play some other stuff, then you kind of bury that connection. That connection can get a little bit lost or obscured. And likewise, if you're playing and then you kind of come down and play a secondary idea, and then you kind of keep the melody down here, well then again, you've kind of lost that connection. It's not going to be quite as clear that you're picking up where you left off. It's going to maybe almost sound like the main line kind of. I don't know if these visuals make any sense to anybody but me, but outtake.
I'll do that thing like, welcome to the Disney Channel, and like trace whatever you're doing with your hand and see what shapes you're actually making.
It's like a banana or something. Like, what? I didn't know I was doing that. A good place to start, sort of the essential place to start, is learn the melody first, just on its own, even with 2 mallets, even with 1 mallet. Just forget about 4 mallets for a second and just learn the tune. And then a really good place to start next, now whether you're figuring it out by ear, you're looking at a lead sheet or score or whatever, figure out what the bass notes are. Gives you a lot of the information. Like, you'll most of the time just those 2 voices, you'll be able to hear what the harmonies are, even with just those 2 voices. And then take each chord, you know, if there are any unfamiliar chords or anything in the material that you're unfamiliar with, then just mess around with it, just experiment with it. And then I think a really good next step is, before you try putting everything together on the instrument, sing this. And now you got to sing very rubato, very freely, out of time, sing the melody and just play each harmony. You can just play a block chord or an arpeggiated line. So you can start to experiment with what you can do with each of these chords. You're not really even arranging yet, you're just sort of getting to know the material. And so there's like an infinite number of ways that you could go about doing that. Then just experiment with that for a while. You'll get all sorts of accompaniment ideas from doing that. And when you get to a point where you really can sing the melody comfortably and accompany yourself and feel pretty good about it, gradually moving more into time too. Let's start very rubato, totally free, and then gradually start to put a tempo on it. And when you feel like you can pretty much stay in tempo and sing the melody and accompany yourself and feel good about your chords and voicings, that's the thing, you can find, a 4 or 5 or 6 note voicing on a piano. Well, we can't play 4 or 5 notes at a time on the marimba, but you can break them up and arpeggiate them any number of ways, apply permutations to them. So that's where the technique kind of starts to come into play, is you have a bigger idea. How do you state that bigger idea? How do you make that idea audible in some way? And on the marimba, again, so the limitation, but also the fun of it is trying to figure out how to do that with usually only 4 mallets. Or if you're, Liam Teague playing steel pan, you take 2 mallets and you sound like a freaking orchestra. I don't know how he does it. But when you get to a point where you can accompany yourself, that means that you know the melody really well because you're singing it, you know the harmonies really well because you're playing them. Then start to play the melody with your mallets, which means you have to probably thin out some of what you were doing before, but you have a baseline to build from. So you're not trying to do everything all at once right from the beginning. Then you can kind of build it up in layers. And it can be as simple as you want or as complex as you want. Then you got to decide, like, melody rules all. So how you want to state the melody should not be affected by or at least to whatever degree is possible. It shouldn't be affected by how you're accompanying. Ideally, I think it should be the other way around. State the melody the way you want it to be stated, and then fit everything else in and around that. And again, the more you do that, the more sense that'll make, and the more it'll seem possible to just accompany yourself. That's gaining familiarity with the tune in terms of the broader arrangement. What's going to be the introduction? How's it going to develop? How's it going to end? These kind of things. Those kind of ideas kind of happen usually spontaneously. Sometimes I come up with an idea and it turns out that that's the intro, and I didn't even know that at the time. It was just something I was playing around with while experimenting with the tune. Or sometimes it's a little more linear, but don't force any process. I think as soon as you start to follow a process, you're not necessarily being creative anymore. You may find yourself doing the same kind of thing on a few pieces or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. But if the first thing on your mind is, well, I got to follow this process, well then okay, you may be opening some doors, but you're probably also closing others. So I don't know, you just kind of got to figure out how to balance all that, and that's going to be different for everybody. But that's been, like, every piece I've ever written it's been a little bit different. I mean, if I have to crank out music real fast, okay, if I got to have music tomorrow at 8 a.m., okay, then you're probably going to use a formula and get it done, and that's going to be great. If it's just sort of on your own, just for fun, let it grow organically. Just let it do what it wants to do, and just if you're having fun and you're engaged with it, it'll sort of find a way. Do this for fun. I mean, maybe that's the most important thing. Don't feel any pressure and let it develop. The first time I tried to do this, I sounded like crap. Give it time. I felt horrible after my first performance of my first arrangement. Nobody else felt horrible. Everybody else thought it was kind of cool. But I've gone from that to now I'm pretty confident about it, and it's definitely a big part of my life now. I mean, that's, marimba has become my artistic voice. I mean, if I had to pick one medium and everything else goes away, then I'd keep marimba. And if I was going to do, if somebody wanted me to do a special tribute to somebody or something, well, I'd do it on the marimba because that's where I do my best stuff, But that's taken years. I mean, in high school, in early college, I kind of wanted to be able to do this sort of thing, but I was so far away I didn't even know where to start or how to get down that path. The only reason I got to where I am now is because I just keep banging my head against it. I guess I'm just stubborn or something. And it takes a lot. Somebody else might be able to figure out what I'm doing now after however many years. Somebody else might figure out much quicker, but that doesn't matter. Don't worry about how fast somebody else does something, or this has got to be special. It's got to be something you're doing for yourself. And if you're doing it like that, then you eventually will start getting results that you're really proud of, and then eventually, I wouldn't be published right now if it hadn't been for Lalo Davila saying, you got to get published, send your stuff out over and over again for several years. Finally, okay, I think I'll really do it. And that opened up all kinds of possibilities for me. So it's been fun working with Tapspace. I mean, you guys are easy to work with, and you put out good stuff, and everything looks great. And so that's been really fun. Boom!